Hi, welcome back to chapter 28. Today we are going to be continuing with our discussion of the late 19th century. We're going to be looking at sort of the children of Impressionism. We're going to look at what happens in the world of art after this kind of avant-garde movement of Impressionism comes and kind of shakes everything up. We're going to be looking at a movement called Post-Impressionism. We're going to be looking at something called Symbolism, and really a bunch of other smaller movements that could be considered to hang under this umbrella of the umbrellas of Post-Impressionism and Symbolism. All right, so let's get going. So Post-Impressionism. First of all, let me tell you what Post-Impressionism is not. I said it was a movement, but it's really not a movement. Post-Impressionism is more of a description of art that is influenced by Impressionism and kind of went off in its own directions and did its own thing. So Post-Impressionism, the idea is that these artists took what they liked about Impressionism. They liked the sort of avant-garde experimentalism of Impressionism. They loved the use of color. They were, some of them were interested in this idea of truth to materials and really starting to explore the nature of the materials that art is made with and move beyond simply trying to make art that is sort of realistic and what we call representational, meaning that it's meant to sort of represent real things and instead experiment more with the medium itself and see what paint can do and bronze can do and marble can do if you're not constrained by making those things look like a person, place, or thing exactly. Post-Impressionism will veer in weird directions. Some post-impressionists will start, instead of looking outward, will start to look inward. You know, one of the things about Impressionism is that it tried to be objective, meaning that most Impressionist artists simply tried to record what they saw. In fact, that was the whole thing. They took their paintings, their easels out into the world, in this plein air sort of method, and painted whatever they observed. And Post-Impressionism, though, is kind of like this subjective version of that. So what does that mean? So objective, what the Impressionists were trying to do was trying to create a sort of opinionless, unbiased view of the world. They're just recording what they see, sort of just the phenomena that's in front of their faces. But Post-Impressionism and Post-Impressionist artists are starting to want to show more of an interior view. They want to show what the artist is feeling or thinking or how the artist is approaching a subject. It is much more subjective and sort of looking inward, interior, if you will. So let's start with Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec. Toulouse-Lautrec comes from a very old aristocratic family, and he was the oldest child and said to be heir. But Toulouse-Lautrec was born with some genetic problems, some defects. He was also suffered some leg injuries as a child, and this stunted his growth. And at the time, society wasn't very forgiving of people with physical differences. Toulouse-Lautrec, basically, his legs remained the size of a child's, more or less, while his torso grew to normal size. And for a lot of people at this time, he was sort of shunned by society, and it was sort of felt that he couldn't sort of take over kind of his position in this aristocratic family. And so he showed sort of an interest in skills in art from a very young age. Eventually, he moves to Paris, where he sort of hangs out and rents an apartment in the Montmartre district. The Montmartre district we've already talked about a little bit. This is this sort of nightclub, artist, bohemian kind of district in Paris, where there was all sorts of sort of nightclubs and bars and cafes where many of these artists and poets and sort of the kind of bohemian society of Paris in the 16, 17, 1800s kind of hung out and communicated and shared ideas, and that's sort of what Toulouse-Lautrec's sort of world. It's a little seedy. It's a little outside of the mainstream. He often pictured images of drug use, of prostitution, of sort of the darker, grittier side of reality. And he did it in a way that was meant to reflect this sort of kind of left of center bohemian aesthetic, and also the mindset of people who were inebriated or maybe taking drugs. In fact, a popular substance at the time was a kind of alcohol called absinthe. And absinthe, you can barely see it down here. It almost got cut off. Absinthe. Absinthe is a liquor that's made with some sort of mildly what's called psychotropic substances that could cause hallucinatory effects. It's a green liquor, and it was often referred to as the Green Fairy. And that is sort of what Toulouse-Lautrec is playing on in this painting here. So let's take a look at this image at the Moulin Rouge. The Moulin Rouge was one of the really big sort of hot spots, night spots, where you could go and see dancing and singing, and it's a place where the famous French dance, the can-can, was invented. And the Moulin Rouge, if you've ever seen the movie The Moulin Rouge, Toulouse-Lautrec is actually a character in that film. But this painting, in many ways, carries over a lot of the techniques, especially those of the Impressionist painter Degas, with the weird sort of angle and the weird sort of flat areas like this bar protruding in, which had a very much, once again, that Japanese influence. But then there are things that are beyond sort of the Impressionist, where we get more into this subjective view, like the green face of this prostitute here, or the odd sort of green iridescent lighting in the background, which were meant to sort of represent the effects of this absinthe. And but Toulouse-Lautrec wasn't just an artist whose paintings were intended for galleries and museums. He was a commercial artist, and he was an artist who used lithography, that technique that you guys learned about a few lectures ago when we looked at realism and Damier. And lithography and the lithographs of Toulouse-Lautrec here are rather quite stunning and rather still very famous images. You can see the Japanese influence, I think, with the dark outlines in both of these works. The Jean Avril work here, this is an advertisement of a famous dancer. Very much a strong Japanese influence here, and then the image on the left for the Moulin Rouge. But also you can see the weird flattened space, you can see the large sort of abstract areas of color, that these were very modern, these were very avant-garde at the time. And they're still very stunning and striking in their bold colors, very much an influence of Japanese ukiyo-e prints, and their rather bold, sort of graphic, almost simplistic, cartoonish kinds of depiction of the human figure. Now, Georges Seurat is a very different kind of post-impressionism, where Toulouse-Lautrec is sort of decadent, and his works are about the sort of the seedier underbelly of French cafe and society. Georges Seurat often painted the upper and middle classes. His work is often, lack of a better word, very conservative. It's very sort of simple, pure kinds of forms. He came up with a technique that was labeled Neo-Impressionism, but we call it today Pointillism. Pointillism is a really weird, at the time, really weird technique that involved using little points of color, little points of paint that were laid next to each other to create this effect called optical mixing. Optical mixing was, there was a scientist and a theorist named Charles Blanc who came up with this idea that if you put two little dots of color next to each other, your eye will blend those colors together. So if I took like a blue dot and a yellow dots, blue dots and yellow dots, and set them next to each other and then stood away from them, they would blend in to green. There was, at this point, a lot of new scientific discoveries, especially in the fields of optics and color theory, that were really stimulating artists to experiment with new techniques of mixing color. This is also a work that experiments with something called simultaneous contrast. So just a little bit of color theory here. The image on the left is what is called a color wheel. And this is a basic artist tool. And it shows how artists mix colors. Like, for example, you have your three primary colors, yellow, red, and blue. And at the halfway point between these three primary colors, and they're called primary colors because they're irreducible, and all other colors are made from mixing these three colors. Like at the halfway point between yellow and red is orange, between yellow and blue is green, and blue and red is purple. That's what happens when you mix these colors. But also the color wheel shows us what color complements are. And complements are colors that are basically the opposite wavelength. You know, color is light, right? And each color has its own wavelength. And sub-wavelengths are closer and more similar to each other, and that's why the colors sort of blend. But other colors have very opposite wavelengths. And so if I mixed, for example, yellow and purple together, it would more or less, they would cancel each other out. They would turn kind of a grayish color if I mixed yellow and purple, or blue and orange, or red and green. But something happens if I put them next to each other. And this is called simultaneous contrast. And if I put red and purple, or yellow and purple next to each other, or red and green next to each other, they make each other intensify. For example, look at this red and this green and how bold they look next to each other. This is simultaneous contrast. And this is what happens when you put two complements. They kind of leap off the page. But also this is an example. This is another guy named Gauguin, who was another color theorist at the time, who was a big influence on Seurat. If you look at these examples, if you tighten the width of each color bar, all of a sudden the colors start to blend together, even though they're not. Like these red and blue lines, for example, they never actually overlap. They just get smaller and smaller. And so these areas over here look purple, even though if I zoomed in up close, you would see red lines and blue lines. For, you know, the green and red here, which are canceling each other out, start to turn this sort of grayishy, sort of brownish kind of color, don't they? Because those are opposite colors and complements. This is all really high-level stuff, and I don't expect you guys to understand this or really get it at this point. But what I'm trying to make the point that Georges Seurat is trying something really experimental here with color. And he's mixing things with his optical mixing technique that had never really been done before. And this in many ways plays into this whole concept of modernism, is always constantly innovating and pushing forward. And that is exactly what we're seeing here. This is a painting that took a long time. Georges Seurat made, I can't even remember how many preparatory drawings, you know, hundreds, literally, of drawings to prepare for this image, where he was experimenting with different color combinations. And then the painting itself is made up of hundreds of thousands of tiny little dots that he applied simply by making little points of color on the canvas with a paintbrush. What also, I think, makes this painting unique is is the way the figures are painted. Everything is very simple and solid and peaceful. In a way, this is kind of a rejection in some ways of the hustle and bustle of modern life. And it's in a way like it takes sort of the wildness of the brushstrokes of Impressionism, and it controls them and puts them into these very sort of ornate, intricate patterns of brushstrokes and color. It's really cool stuff. But what I love about this painting the most is when you zoom in on it, and the color almost breaks up like static, like if we zoomed in on this little monkey here, or the dog, or this man's face. All of a sudden these little dots just sort of turned almost into just random noise. Seurat is sort of playing with the illusion of art. Once again, this is that whole truth to materials. As you get closer to what you think is an image of people, as you get closer, it actually just breaks apart into smaller little pieces of color. This is also meant to poke a little fun at French society, because in many ways we're seeing an image that doesn't really actually, would never quite exist. We're looking at sort of multiple classes of people. Basically on the bank of the River Seine in Paris, we're looking at sort of rich and poor, upper class, lower class, all kind of hanging out together in this sort of beautiful harmony, just like the harmony of colors mix together, but in a way that French society was not like. Like many societies, it was very stratified, and there was very very big differences between the rich and poor classes, the working classes and the elite classes, and in many ways this is kind of creating a kind of a utopia that would never exist, but in a way that's meant to be a little bit funny. Okay. Vincent van Gogh, and I'm going to say Van Gogh because he's Dutch and that's how his name would have been pronounced, but if you want to say Van Gogh, go ahead. Alright, so here we go, guys. I didn't even mean to do that one. So Vincent van Gogh, of course, is one of the most famous painters of all time. And he's a painter who actually got a very, very late start. Vincent van Gogh was born in the Netherlands. His early years were sort of, I don't want to say misguided, but he certainly kind of wandered around without a strict purpose. He was born into a very religious family. In fact, his father was a minister, and Vincent van Gogh himself was deeply religious, and as we shall see, that he will even sort of flirt with the ministry as we'll see in a little bit. His closest friend was his brother Theo, who was I believe a year younger than Vincent van Gogh was. He was at a very young age very sensitive. He was prone to emotional outbursts, and these things started to get worse as he got older. Vincent van Gogh suffered from a mental illness that we're still really not sure how to define it. I've read all sorts of theories, everything from epilepsy, to schizophrenia, to bipolar disorders, to, I've read all sorts of theories. We don't know because the kinds of modern medicine to analyze the psychology of a sick person didn't exist. So we don't know. We can only sort of take educated guesses, and it could have been a combination of illnesses. But what we do know is that, he was often prone to sort of violent outbursts, to long periods of deep depression and emotional instability, and this caused him severe problems throughout his life. And he was a man who was aware that he was sick and he had problems. He often would seek help from doctors, and there was no real help for him, unfortunately. So Vincent van Gogh initially wants to be an art dealer. His brother Theo is also an art dealer, and he decides to go into that business. He works for the sort of biggest art dealer one of the biggest art dealers in Europe, Pointillism. in The Hague, the city in the Netherlands, and he's transferred to London, where he lives there for a while. He sees the work of J.M.W. Turner, and he's sort of moved by that stuff. Vincent van Gogh was a man who was deeply intelligent. He spoke multiple languages, something like 7 or 8 languages. He was well versed in the Bible. He was an incredibly intelligent man. He's definitely benefited from this travel, but he didn't get along with his superiors in this rather prestigious art dealership, and he had problems, and he eventually got fired. He decides then he's going to go in the other family business, and that is to become a minister. And he was very ill-suited for that too. As you can imagine, a man who is prone to violent outbursts and mood swings and periods of deep depression is not necessarily a man you want in a position who is often meant to console and nurture members of his parish. He did spend some time, though, in Belgium, working in a town with coal miners in a very, very poor village, trying to minister to these incredibly poor people who were suffering from ailments often related to coal mining. And it is here that he starts to really seriously paint. And it is really not until the late 1870s, early 1880s, when Vincent van Gogh is almost 30 years old, that he really starts to take art seriously and decides that he's going to become a painter. Partially it's so he can kind of celebrate God, something he wanted to do as a minister, but he couldn't really do well, so he's like, well, maybe through my art I can. And so this image called the Potato Eaters is really Vincent van Gogh's first significant piece. He studied here and there with a few tutors, but he's mostly self-taught. And you can really see Vincent van Gogh's style change and mature and him become a better artist. But by the end of his career, which lasted only a little over a decade, Vincent van Gogh produced something like 2,000 works of art. So once he decided he wanted to take up this endeavor, he went for it 100%. But this image, the Potato Eaters, in many ways is probably unlike the kinds of images you're used to seeing from Vincent van Gogh, which an artist known for his color. But his early work is influenced heavily by Dutch masters. I mean, this is a guy who grew up in the Netherlands, and he would have been familiar, of course, with the works of people like Rembrandt. And sort of the dark tenebrism of those works would have been a big influence on him, and you can certainly see that influence here, I think. But this is really his earliest painting of any real insignificance. Van Gogh also started in his late 20s, early 30s, really experiencing sort of major problems with his mental illness. And part of this was also exacerbated. It was made worse by 2 failed relationships. He was rejected by a cousin who he's in love with, and then there was another woman who he was involved with for a while and had sort of a very tempestuous affair with, and neither one of these worked out. And they both led, or I would say contributed to more problems with his mental stability. Vincent van Gogh in 1886 goes to Paris, where he lives with his brother Theo, and he's really gets sort of involved in and interested in a sort of late French Impressionism and the influences of Impressionism, especially Japanese art. And in fact, what we're looking at here is an image on the right, is a painting that Vincent van Gogh did in imitation of a Japanese ukiyo-e printmaker, Endo Hiroshige. And you can see sort of the direct copying here. Like, and this is once again something that many young artists who are learning their craft and trade have been doing since, the Middle Ages, is copying works of masters they admire. And Vincent van Gogh made several copies of Japanese prints as a way to sort of learn and master the sort of rich color that he loved. Vincent van Gogh eventually moves to Arles in southern France, and he wants to get out of Paris. While Paris was very good to him, he made several contacts with some Impressionist and Post-Impressionist painters who will become really big influences and important to him. One of those is a guy named Paul Gauguin, but he was in touch with many of the great Impressionists on sort of one level or another, mostly meeting them through his brother Theo. But he's starting to get kind of restless in Paris. Plus, he feels that living in the big city, living in the dire poverty that he was living in, was no good for his mental health. And he wants to move to the country, and so he does. And it is here in Arles that really we start to see Van Gogh's mature phase. So around 1887, 1888. And it is here he really starts experimenting with color in a very bold sort of way, in a way that moves beyond just sort of impressionist interest in color and that phenomenon called local color, and he starts to use color as a way of kind of expressing himself. And this painting in particular, I think, uses color in a way that is meant to show how he feels. Actually, let me move to the next slide. This is a bar, a cafe in Arles, and you can see what he says here. I have tried to express the terrible passions of humanity by means of red and green. The room is blood red and dark yellow, with a green billiard table in the middle. There are 4 lemon yellow lamps with a glow of orange and green. Notice how detailed he is in these descriptions of color. Everywhere there's a clash and contrast of the most alien reds and greens, and the figures of little sleeping hooligans in the empty, dreary room in violet and blue, the blood red and the yellow green of the billiard table, for interest, contrasts with the soft, tender Louis XV green of the counter, on which there is a rose nosegay. The white clothes of the landlord, watchful in a corner of that furnace, turned lemon yellow or pale luminous green. Look at the words he's using to describe these words, these colors. He uses blood red, pale luminous green. These colors almost are taking kind of an emotional life of their own. And in a way, he's trying to express. He's using color. He's not in a way, but he's exactly trying to use color to express the kind of sadness of the humanity who would be in a cafe or really a bar, because that's really what this is, late at night, sort of drinking themselves into a stupor. And this is something that Vincent van Gogh would have understood, because he often used alcohol as a way to sort of self-medicate. But also look at the way not only he's using this bold, intense color, that blood red especially, to create almost kind of like a hellish kind of nightscape, but look at the brush strokes. He's using very thick impasto here to give the painting a sense of texture, but also to give it a sense of a kind of a nervous energy. These brushstrokes, the lines in the brushstrokes aren't just sort of straight lines, but instead they're painted with this kind of nervous, unsteady hand that also helps represent, I think, the intensity of this moment that he's experiencing as he's looking around and seeing the patrons of this bar. So he stays in Arles for a while. And this is also where he begins to paint his sunflower pieces. In 1888, the summer of 1888, he paints he begins to paint through 88 and 89 four what are known as the sunflower paintings. And then he also does some smaller versions of two of these paintings. For him, the sunflower was this mysterious, sort of bold and also kind of ugly sort of flower. But for him, it also represents gratitude. And one of these paintings he actually ends up giving to a friend of his who he meets in Paris, a guy named Paul Gauguin. And here's the spelling, Gauguin. Paul Gauguin. Paul Gauguin and Van Gogh realize they have a lot in common. They want to use color in a very expressive way. To express their emotions and spiritual ideas and all these other sorts of things. And they decide they're going to start basically an artist school or an artist colony even in Arles. And this is exciting to both men. And Paul Gauguin comes at the end of 1888 to stay with Van Gogh, and their friendship and their sort of living situation doesn't even last 2 months. Both men are very intense men who often drank way too much, and Van Gogh at this point is very emotionally and mentally unstable, prone to violent outbursts. And in fact, it is after one of these particularly violent outbursts that Gauguin and him get into a fight, and Van Gogh then very famously and very sadly severs his own ear. And then, of course, the story is that there is a woman, a prostitute in town who he has feelings for, and he sends her his ear. And of course, this is very tragic. And I don't want to play up the sensationalism of this moment, because this is a very horrible thing. This horrible act that he committed against himself obviously shows a man who's incredibly unstable and not well. This is a painting that he painted in October, sort of in preparation for Gauguin coming to visit. It is one of, I want to say 3 paintings that he did of his bedroom at Arles. And we can see that sort of intense color that we've seen in the Night Cafe. We can see those weird sort of oblique angles that are very familiar in Japanese kinds of art. But also some of these angles are true to the room itself. This was a very old house, and it was starting to have some problems with the foundation and the walls, and some of those walls were actually really skewed like that. But by December, Gauguin is gone, and this leaves Vincent van Gogh in a very, very deep state of depression. Van Gogh goes to a place called Saint-Rémy, in a mental institution there. And it is here where, in end of 88, beginning of 1889, that he really reaches his most productive phase. And he produces, of course, the very famous Starry Night. This was painted in his asylum. His doctors allowed him to paint. He has booked himself into a mental institution with the hopes of getting better. But of course, guys, our knowledge of the human mind and of mental illnesses was still in its earliest stages at this point, and there was very little that doctors could do to help Vincent van Gogh. So he paints furiously during this period, and he creates Starry Night. And he says about Starry Night, "Why, I say to myself, should the spots of light in the firmament be less accessible to us than the black spots on the map of France? Just as we take the train to go to Tarascon or Rouen, we take death to go to a star." And so here he's contemplating his own mortality. In a way, he's almost, this is a man who's deeply depressed, and he knows in a way that he's not long for this world. It will only be a few months later that he will walk out into a field very similar to this and commit suicide by shooting himself with a shotgun. And for him, these stars in the sky represent sort of a glimmer of hope, maybe in the afterlife, where his soul will ascend to these little spots in the sky in a way that it is as easy to jump on a train and travel to a city 40, 50 miles away. Vincent van Gogh is using intense color in this painting to almost like create this sense of vibration, as if we are looking at maybe a pool of water and somebody throws in a stone and it begins to ripple and move. Also, there's this idea of ascension. He talks about almost traveling to the stars, and we see these swirling shapes which could possibly represent clouds in the nighttime sky, but are more likely meant to sort of imply a kind of spiritual journey to the stars. We also see this great cypress tree that he has painted sort of like a black flame. It's almost like he's flipped the land and the sky, where the sky is full of color and vibrancy, and the land itself is sort of dark and foreboding and almost has a sort of almost demonic kind of quality to it. Vincent van Gogh, we know so much about him because of his letters to his brother, and also to a lesser degree to his sister. But he was a voracious writer. And he wrote thousands and thousands and thousands of letters and journal entries throughout his life. And so we know so much about him because of this. And we know so much about his work. And so, all of these things that I'm quoting here come from his letters. And this will also be very significant after the end of his life, as we'll see in just a moment. So Vincent van Gogh paints Starry Night. And then in 1890, in July, he commits suicide. He tried to get better. He left the asylum, and then he started to seek help from a doctor named Paul Gachet, and none of this worked. And he commits suicide. And his brother Theo knows that Vincent is ill, and he comes down to visit him, and he sees Vincent, basically finds him with a gunshot wound. And Vincent lived something like another almost 24 hours before he passed away. And then 6 months later, his brother and closest friend Theo passes away. And so it is after Vincent van Gogh's death that actually he started to gain notoriety. Because during his life, Vincent van Gogh didn't sell, depending on sort of which historian you ask, he only sold 1 or 2 paintings his entire career. And this is with having a brother who was an art dealer, who was constantly trying to help him. And in many ways, Vincent's intense poverty also didn't help his mental illness, because he felt constantly, like a failure, and he often struggled just to survive, much less buy paints. And if his brother hadn't helped him, he wouldn't have probably been able to create the work that he did. Now, after the death of Vincent and Theo van Gogh, Theo's wife published the letters that Vincent wrote to Theo. And she actually sort of made it kind of her life's mission, in a way, to promote the work of her dead brother-in-law. And even though after she remarries, she still is really in many ways one of Van Gogh's most ardent supporters. So this is a guy who definitely benefited from family. Not necessarily his parents, who in many ways were kind of rejected him, but his siblings and even his extended family, a sister-in-law. And it is because of this that Van Gogh was started to get notice. As his letters were published, and then his sister-in-law set up several retrospective shows of his work afterwards, and his reputation grew and grew and grew and grew, and within like 15, 20 years after his death, he was considered one of the great artists of his period. And of course now Vincent van Gogh is considered one of the great artists. But what he does can't be understated, because he took the idea that painting can move beyond what we see, and painting can express what we feel. It can be an emotional act, and not just the fact that color and sort of brushstrokes can represent and express our inner emotions in a what we call expressionist painting. But art can be spiritual. Art can be, in itself, sort of transformative and transport us to other places, spiritually, for instance. So now let's look at Paul Gauguin, another artist who was incredibly influential who will be incredibly influential in 20th century art, and next to Vincent's brother Theo, probably the man closest, well, one of the men closest to him throughout his life, even though it was very briefly. Paul Gauguin was a stockbroker. There was a stock market crash. There was a recession, and he loses his job. And he takes this as a sign from God that he should pursue painting. This is something he always wanted to do, but he didn't really, he never really pursued it. He wanted to please his family. So he had this professional career. But Gauguin, in many ways, his behavior is hard to excuse, because the story is that he basically leaves his wife and children to go pursue being an artist. So Gauguin goes to a place in France called Brittany, which at the time is still very rural, and it's very traditional, and the people of Brittany are practicing this very traditional form of Catholicism, which really hasn't changed much since the Middle Ages. In fact, if we look at this image here of these Breton women, you can see they're wearing these very traditional, almost peasant-like kinds of outfits. And it is in this rural area where Gauguin is around, where he feels are more like real people outside of the city, people that are closer to God, closer to nature. He feels that he can really create a kind of painting that connects to a sort of spiritual outlook, because this is his primary goal. And like Gauguin, like Van Gogh, he's very interested in uses of color for emotional and spiritual expression. But in many ways, he pushes color even further away than Gauguin does. If we look at this painting here, called The Vision After the Sermon, where we have this image of Breton women who have left church, they have left Mass, and now sort of filled with this kind of Holy Spirit, they're having this sort of shared vision where they're witnessing a scene from the Bible where Jacob is wrestling with an angel. And Gauguin is using this blood red, once again, that blood red color, but whereas Van Gogh used it in a way to sort of almost in a demonic sort of way. Here he uses it Gauguin is using this color in a way to denote a kind of spiritual state, that these women are witnessing something outside of the normal realm of existence, and they're looking into something beyond, in the spiritual realm. And we even see this tree branch, which sort of symbolically cuts the two worlds in half. the world of everyday, the earthly world, and then the spiritual world. And these are primarily his concerns. But also you can see the influence of Japanese art with the bold outlines, the big flat areas of color, that sort of weird flattened bird's eye perspective that we've seen in Japanese art. But also in general, there is a sort of simplicity of the forms. Everything is sort of reduced, and the word is abstracted. To abstract something means to reduce things to kind of its simplest forms. In art. Notice, like, for example, the shapes of the women's bonnets are almost form these flat white kinds of basic sort of shapes without a lot of detail. They are abstracted. But this is also leads us to a term called primitivism. And this is a word that's a little loaded, because the term primitivism means art that looks primitive. And the term primitive has some cultural baggage with it, because when we say the word primitive, we often mean that cultures that aren't as advanced. And this is often used to describe non-European cultures. And remember, there's this whole sort of push. And it's really begun with Romanticism and Neoclassicism, this interest in art outside of the European tradition. And we really see that explode in the Impressionist era with Japonisme. But we're seeing this expand even more, and artists are looking outside of European traditions into Asian and African and Native American traditions of Oceania, traditions of really a lot of other places outside of Europe. And this term primitive is used to describe the influence of these non-European cultures, but also, there's a certain kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? There's a certain kind of unfairness in that term. Because many of the cultures that these Europeans are drawing from are very old cultures with very long traditions, artistic traditions, that often involve years and years and years of study and skill to master. And so calling these things primitive sort of implies something that is lesser. So, but it's a term that we still use because it describes the sort of spirit, right, of the age, I guess. Gauguin is not just looking for non-European cultures, though. He's looking at past European cultures, and especially the Middle Ages, for his inspiration. He's looking a lot at stained glass windows, and he's looking at a metal technique called cloisonné. Cloisonné is a technique that became really is really well known to be used in the period called the Byzantine period during the early Middle Ages. And it is a form of enamel. So basically it's kind of a glass on metal technique. And cloisonné, it refers to these thin metal strips that surround the individual glass pieces. Cloison literally means like fence or gate or partition. And so this term was used to describe, in many ways, the effect that Gauguin was going for with this sort of cloisonné effect. You can see that especially around the mustache and the beard of Christ here, for instance. But this is a Byzantine cloisonné medallion. So. This is another work of Breton women having this sort of spiritual vision, and in this case he's using the color yellow to represent Christ. And yellow has a symbolic sort of spiritual meaning here. It represents both sort of this idea of kind of the sun and sunrise and holy light and sort of glory, but it also can represent things like sickness and refers to Christ's sacrifice. So he's using the yellow here not only in the body of Christ, but really in sort of the landscape itself in this kind of spiritual sort of way. But in many ways, these paintings from this period where he was in Brittany that often show a connection between, a literal connection between the modern everyday world and the sort of spiritual world, coming together and interacting with each other, is exactly what he wanted his paintings to be, as kind of like a way to connect us to this sort of deeper spiritual world. So Gauguin eventually leaves Europe entirely, and he goes to Tahiti. And he had a daughter who died. He goes to Tahiti, and he actually goes to Tahiti twice, I think. But Tahiti is an island in the South Pacific, and at the time it was French territory. And he really wants to get away from the modern world. He wants to sort of forget his troubles, but also he wants to live among a people that he feels are closer to sort of a spiritual kind of existence. And it is here that he creates many paintings that deal with this sort of spiritual, these spiritual themes. And this one is called Where Do We Come From? What Are We? Where Are We Going? And in many ways, this is a painting that, a large painting, a 12-foot by 4-foot painting that questions sort of our idea of mortality, our idea, the concepts of destiny. And it sort of mixes cultures here. From looking at the painting from right to left, it depicts birth, life, and death, with the image of sort of a baby, a youth, and an old lady. But in between we have sort of references to both Tahitian culture and Tahitian religion and Tahitian idols, but also biblical imagery, like with the image of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil from the book of Genesis, and this idea that we can even see this woman over here eating a fruit. So this idea that sort of life in some ways is about acquiring the knowledge maybe of the spiritual. But look how he's using this color. The background, the sense of illusionism is completely gone. He doesn't even want... he's not even trying to make this look like a real background, but instead he's using, notice how he's using really cool colors. So here's some more of that color theory. He's using complementary colors and cool colors to make the warmer colors in the front really stand out. But, you know, once again, he's using color in as much of a sort of a spiritual and subjective way as anything else. This last one I want to look at just very, very briefly. This is another a painting with spiritual concern. It's called the Sea of Arioi. It is based on a Tahitian myth, but also, once again, there's a relation to biblical imagery with the idea here of sort of forbidden fruit. But we see this young Tahitian woman. But what I want you to really focus on are her legs in comparison to her body. This very much evokes Egyptian art and sort of the flattened forms with the oftentimes the legs going one direction in opposition to the torso, as we often see in Egyptian art. And this is another ancient culture that he's referencing. So Gauguin is kind of picking and choosing. He's almost using this sort of history of art as kind of a buffet of ideas and styles to feed in to his own art and to sort of his own vision. And Gauguin passed away. Gauguin died. He was very upset, like Gauguin, like Van Gogh. He went through periods of depression. He even tried to commit suicide. Eventually, he died of an infection while in Tahiti. All right, Cézanne. So, if Gauguin and Van Gogh sort of say that art can be spiritual, art can represent sort of these deeper states of being, Cézanne, in many ways, is going the opposite way. Cézanne isn't really concerned with spirituality. But Cézanne, as a post-impressionist, is more interested in trying to understand how painting works. This is going to be one of the most difficult artists I will be talking about this entire semester, because his art is not easy, and it's not meant to be easy. His art is not made for people who are casual fans of art. His art is made for people who have a serious interest in art and the way we view the world. And in many ways, he's like Georges Seurat, where he approaches art almost scientifically. But there's sort of a philosophy to Cézanne's work. Because Cézanne wants to understand the nature, really, of what art is. And more importantly, how does art work? Let me explain this. Let me see if I can put this into terms that we'll all understand. When we look at a painting, we see what? What do you see? I see a church, right? I see churches. I see people on a street. I see horses and carriages in a square. I see people dancing on a dance floor. But that's not really what I see, is it? What I'm actually seeing is paint on a canvas. And I know it's paint on a canvas. I know those aren't actually people there. I know there are no people and there is no dancing. What's really going on is there's a piece of canvas with paint on it. And I can even see the paint, because this is an impressionist work and the artist used very loose brushstrokes. So I can even see the paint, and yet when I look at this, I say, well, that's a woman, that's a man, that's a chandelier, those are people, and they're all dancing. But I know that's not true. What I'm really seeing is paint on canvas. And so what Cézanne is asking is, why? Why do we see people when we obviously know that this is not true, when this is obviously a lie? How come we believe the lie of painting? And how come we've been believing this lie since the beginning of painting for 40,000 years? How come we can all see a bunch of paint on a canvas or a crayon on a piece of paper or whatever it is and look at it and go, that's a car, that's a person, that's a dog, that's a house, when we know it isn't? Why do we buy into a lie that we know is a lie? What is going on in our brain when we look at paint on a canvas? He wants to figure it out. It's a pretty good question, don't you think? So Cézanne comes from a sort of impressionist background. He studied with Pissarro, the impressionist artist. He was sort of friends with, he went to school with Émile Zola, the realist writer. He has a background in this sort of modernist, in this early sort of modernist stuff. And one of the things that he's sort of most concerned about is this concept of truth to materials. He believes paint should look like paint. He believes that paintings, since they are flat, they should look flat. This is another interesting thing about art. Not only do I see things that aren't there, but I see depth that isn't there. Like at this painting here that we're looking at. I see a mountain. There is no mountain. And I see a mountain far away. Well, there is no far away, is there? Paintings are flat. Everything is the same distance. There's only up and down and left and right. There's only two dimensions on a painting, and yet I still see background, middle ground, and foreground. It's right there in front of me. So Cézanne comes up with basically a plan, with a technique, with a way of painting. He decides he's going to simplify. And he's going to, as you see in the quote here, treat nature by the cylinder, the sphere, and the cone. He's going to sort of reduce everything to these simple geometric shapes and forms, with the idea that if he can reduce things and simplify things. He can maybe understand the nature of painting and the nature of how we see things better and more clearly. Okay, so let me go back here. So this is a painting of a Mount Sainte-Victoire. This is a mountain in France that Cézanne grew up around. He sort of lives his life around, and he ends up at one point sort of renting a house right across from it. Because like Monet before him, he wants to sort of study the same physical phenomenon, the same places, the same sites, over and over and over again, at different times of the day, different times of the year, to understand how an object can change under different sort of conditions of light and other sort of environmental conditions. And this mountain kind of becomes his obsession. And so his earliest paintings of Mount Sainte-Victoire are fairly realistic. They're sort of impressionistic, but they more or less conform to sort of the standard rules of painting. You have a foreground, a middle ground, and a background. Let's go back again. You have a foreground, a middle ground, and a background. You have objects that are more or less identifiable: houses, trees, field, aqueduct. You have this more or less sort of understandable image. And he decides to start reducing, to start abstracting what he sees, with the idea that maybe by simplifying things and getting to the basic sort of core of what painting is, which is basically basic shapes and colors, cylinders, cones, spheres, basic simple colors, then maybe he can understand things better. So he starts to experiment. And over time, over a period of almost 20 years, he starts creating a series of paintings of Mount Sainte-Victoire. Dozens and dozens and dozens of paintings, each time simplifying more, reducing his color palette. So he basically reduces it down to the sort of basic colors of nature: greens, yellows, blues. That's more or less it. And so by the time we get, there's this image over here, right over there, there. By the time we get to sort of the end game here, his images almost look like pixels on a screen. They're just simple sort of blobs of color. And if we look at this image, which is one of the last produced, we can see that he's not only simplified the shapes to more or less sort of, kind of smudgy squares and rectangles of color, but he's reduced the color to very simple, almost pure greens, yellows, and blues, with a little bit of orange here and there. And yet, this is the amazing thing, and yet, even though I am looking at a scene that does not look like any mountain or field or sky I have ever seen in my life, because I've never seen a sky made out of big chunky blocks of blue paint, and I've never seen a field made out of stacks of color, because that's really what we're looking at, right? Just green and yellow blocks kind of stacked on top of each other. And they're all more or less the same size, so there's no real illusion of depth. The blocks don't get smaller the further away they are from you, because they're just stacked on top of each other on this two-dimensional surface. And yet, I still see depth. I see a foreground and a middle ground and a background. And I still see a mountain and trees and houses, even though these don't look like mountains, trees, and houses at all. Cézanne understands that if you reduce things even to their simplest forms, but still arrange them in a way that is familiar to us, we will still read into them the image that is trying to be created and come across. Yeah, it's weird, and it's not easy, and it's not meant to be easy. One of the ways he understood that you can sort of create a feeling of depth, even on a flat surface, even by just stacking blocks of color on top of each other, is by using alternating warm and cool colors. So if you'll notice, the field basically consists of a row or a stack of green. On top of that is a stack of yellow, green, yellow, green, yellow, green, up and up and up. Alternating. And even though they're stacked on top of each other vertically, we read them as having horizontal depth. Cézanne applied the same method not only to images of Mount Saint Victoire, but also images of the nude. Cézanne chose sort of the basic subject matter of Western European art. Landscapes, still lifes, and nudes. He didn't want to reinvent the wheel here because he was trying to figure out how the wheel worked. So he uses the real basic kinds of subject matter. And we can see he's doing the same thing in this image called, is often referred to as the Large Bathers, because this is a very large painting. It's a 7 by 8 foot painting. And once again, he's stacking blocks of color on top of each other. He's using a cooler color palette here. He's using mostly sort of blues and violets and greens with some oranges in the foreground, but he's more or less sort of doing the same thing. He's using a very simple color palette. And yet, we are still seeing, foreground, middle ground, and background, and we're still seeing sky. This painting becomes a very influential painting to a lot of modern artists, and we're going to see this painting especially have a really big effect on Pablo Picasso. I want to look at one last Cézanne, really two, but this is one of his still lifes, and to me this is a painting that really shows that Cézanne is trying to understand the illusion of space. Of three-dimensional space on a two-dimensional surface. We're looking at something that, an image that should be impossible. If you see, we have a table, and sitting on the table are several objects, jars and vases and wine bottles and a bowl of fruit. And it doesn't look that strange. But if you really examine what's going on here, what you're looking at is something impossible. And that is, if you look at the table, you'll notice that the back of the table doesn't quite connect all the way. And the front of the table, or the side of the table, doesn't appear to be operating in the same three-dimensional space as the back of the table. It's weirdly cut off here. And to make matters even worse, if you really think about it, here's a flat surface. The table is kind of like this. It's not like this, but it's like this. And then that means the objects sitting on it are kind of attached like that. And yet some of the objects are shown from one angle, like the plate with the fruit on it is shown one way, but the vases and the jars are shown at a completely different angle. They both should be like this or like this, but they're like that in this impossible way that should never even exist. And yet, on this two-dimensional surface, this canvas, this doesn't look nearly as strange as it should, because the rules of the sort of rules of three dimensions don't operate the same in a painting as they do in real life. Basically, painting is its own thing with its own rules that are separate from the rules of reality, of real three-dimensional space. And this is what Cézanne is getting at. And it is strange, and it is weird, and it is totally new. And it is the kind of thing that is not really appealing to sort of casual fans of art. I think of Cézanne sort of as like a person who really, really, really is into cars, and not just sort of the way cars run, or or not just into how cars look, or how what the style of car, the colors of car, or even whether cars are fast or slow. But this is the kind of guy who opens up the hood and knows about everything that the engine does. And in a way, what he's sort of doing with painting is he's looking under the hood and he's tinkering and he's moving things around and he's souping some things up and he's seeing what would happen if you didn't use this part at all. He's trying to understand how the motor runs, right? And this is appealing for a lot of artists who often have these sort of questions, but it's not necessarily appealing for the public at large. And this starts to create, in many ways, sort of a split between art, which has always been a popular art form, and the people. And you start to see art becoming in some ways more exclusive and harder and more difficult to understand. And this is a separation that will continue throughout the modern period. Here's another Cézanne doing more or less the same thing. Okay. So symbolism. Symbolism is a style of art that was heavily influenced by people like Gauguin. It examines the issue of imagination, fantasy, and formal changes in the art of the symbolist. They wanted to understand the expression of modern psychic life, what was going on in our heads in the art of the symbolist. There was a poet named Rimbaud, a French poet, who said artists must become deranged to achieve a seer's insight. This is going to have a big effect on symbolism. Symbolism is a style of art that deals with personal expression. And this idea that to really understand sort of the deep secrets of the universe and of the world, one must go a little mad. We're also going to study a guy named Alpoturier, who wrote an essay on Gauguin that was a big influence on symbolism. So here's a guy named Pierre Puvis de Chavannes, who is not an official member of the symbolist group, but is often lumped in with them because his work is very similar. And this is an image called Sacred Grove, and it's set in sort of this Greek mythological setting. But it's very hard to decipher. It's not from one sort of specific Greek myth, but like with a lot of symbolist work, the images are meant to have sort of a very personal meaning, and it's not something that you could sort of read up on Greek mythology and understand what's going on here, because it is not dealing with sort of recognizable symbols, but personal symbols that only really Puvis de Chavannes could understand. But I think if you really want a good idea of what symbolism is, we have to look at Gustave Moreau, another French artist. And he often incorporated sort of traditional mythological subject matter. We have here an image of the Greek god, or the Roman god Jupiter. Over here we have a biblical story, the story of John the Baptist and Salome from the Bible. But they're constructed in a way that seems almost dreamlike. The symbolists believe very much that there was hidden meaning in dreams, and they would take these sort of common stories, biblical stories and mythological stories, but make them almost dreamlike. They would, Moreau especially, would fill his works with these sort of ornate, almost Baroque kinds of stacks of symbols that are almost indecipherable, that drew from biblical stories and Greek and Roman mythology, and even Hindu religion and all sorts of other kinds of world beliefs, to create something that was almost impenetrably difficult to decipher, that will ultimately offer us no clear meaning, but instead represent kind of a personal view and symbolism of the artists themselves. Odilon Redon. Odilon Redon is another artist associated with symbolists who often use, once again, standard sort of Greek mythology. Here we have Polyphemus, the Cyclops from Homer's Odyssey, but in this rather sort of strange, almost childlike way. This ancient Greek monster is portrayed here almost as sort of an innocent. Notice the use of color in this very subjective way, very much like Gauguin, creating sort of a, once again, something that is almost has more personal meaning to the artist than it does to the viewer, and in some ways that makes it more intriguing. We want to decipher these symbols. We want to cut through the layers of meaning and get to the sort of essential meaning. Henri Rousseau is an artist who received no formal training, and during his career was often mocked and made fun of by other artists for his simplistic kinds of painting, his almost childlike sort of depictions of humans and animals. But in our modern day, Rousseau has certainly has an influence. I'm exhausted. But Rousseau's work today, is considered, sort of he's considered one of the great artists of the symbolist movement, and he has certainly influenced countless of other artists since his time. But his work often evokes sort of a kind of a childlike sort of view of the world. I always associated his work as something you could almost see in like a children's illustration. But it's often very difficult to decipher what his paintings are actually about. James Ensor is a Belgian artist who layered, like many symbolists do, layered and layered and layered and layered his paintings with almost indecipherable symbols, characters and people, and performing sort of acts that are almost indescribable. In this image, Christ entering into Brussels, we see a rather sort of kind of bitter take on modern life, where this image that Christ has returned, but people are so sort of wrapped up in their own lives and their own selves, they sort of overshadow the coming or the second coming of Christ here. An artist who is not a symbolist, but in many ways sort of represents a lot of symbolist ideas, is the Danish artist Edvard Munch, who created the very famous painting, The Scream. He actually created several versions of this, both as paintings and prints. But like the symbolist, he's trying to express a sort of very personal sort of viewpoint here. And like Van Gogh before him, he's using the color and the application of the paint in this very expressive sort of way to express his emotions, in this case, a kind of inner turmoil. This is a quote from him. I was walking along the road with two friends. The sun was setting. Suddenly, the sky turned blood red. I paused, feeling exhausted, and leaned on the fence. There was blood and tongues of fire above the blue-black fjord and the city. My friends walked on, and I stood there trembling with anxiety, and I sensed an infinite scream passing through nature. So he's walking along, and all of a sudden he's sort of overcome with this feeling of just this intense emotion, this sort of feeling that nothing is right. Maybe it's this intense evil or an intense sadness or whatever it is. It's overwhelming to him, and his only reaction to it is to just scream. Themes of sort of alienation, themes of being overwhelmed by the modern world are a common subject matter in modern art. The world changed radically so fast that it almost left people's heads spinning. And there's this feeling that the world was no longer a comprehensible or understandable place. And this caused a tremendous amount of anxiety. And he's using color and he's using the texture of the paint on the canvas to help reinforce this unstable sense of anxiety. He's also using sort of complementary colors, opposite colors, yellows and the sort of purplish black next to each other, and these colors intensify each other. So once again, here's an artist using that color theory that Georges Seurat used, but in a way that is emotional and meant to express emotion. Gustav Klimt was part of a movement out of Austria called the Vienna Secessionists. To secede means to leave, and they wanted to leave the Austrian Art Academy. And, this is a theme that we have seen in European art since, 1855 in Courbet. The Vienna Secessionists especially were fascinated by artistic influences outside of the European realm, especially medieval influences, especially Japanese art, sort of the usual suspects here. And Klimt especially drew heavily from the mosaics of medieval and Byzantine art, as you can see in his very famous image here, The Kiss. And what's fascinating about this is, while the faces of the couple and the arms appear, relatively realistic and three-dimensional, the rest of the painting is flat. And it's sort of, once again, kind of emphasizing the flatness, the truth through the material, that painting is flat. But also you'll notice that it's incredibly decorative. What in many ways Klimt is doing here is sort of blurring the line between art and design. There had always been in Western art a separation between the fine arts, between things like painting and sculpture, and then what are considered craft, utilitarian arts, things like weaving, pottery, woodworking, crafts that are used primarily to make utilitarian objects that have a function. And the idea is that no matter how beautiful those objects are, no matter how beautiful that tapestry or that quilt may be, no matter how beautiful that furniture may be, it's not art. Its beauty is purely decorative. And Klimt is saying, well, there's no real difference here. Why can't a tapestry or a quilt or a piece of furniture be beautiful? And so what he's doing here is he's combining sort of decorative patterns that one would be more likely to see in, on a tapestry or a quilt, and sort of representing those decorative kinds of patterns in a painting, a fine work of art. And so he's creating something here that can be viewed, yes, as an image of a couple and sort of in this romantic embrace. But if you erase them from this picture, all that you're left with is basically just shapes and patterns. You're left with pretty much an abstract design. And really the primary sort of impact of this painting doesn't come necessarily from the depiction of the couple, but it comes from the patterns and the textures and the colors of the paint on the canvas used in a decorative way. And that is where we are going to stop today. I'll see you next time.